It is a real pleasure for me to introduce Jim Mann tonight. He is an old friend and former journalistic colleague of my husband Brad's. I was going to say competitor, but that would be mean, and they really weren't competitive. They were friendly competitors. How about that? When Brad was at the Washington Post, and Jim is somebody whose reporting and writing we have admired for many, many years. Tonight he'll be talking about his new book. It's called, this is pretty easy to remember, George W. Bush. I think many of you know Jim from his prize-winning reporting days at the LA Times. He spent 20 years at the paper covering a range of issues. He was also the Beijing bureau chief for the newspaper. He migrated finally after an illustrious career as a reporter. He decided to become a full-time author. He has a perch at SAIS and has now written 7 books on topics ranging from China to national security. And we were just saying he's close to the record, I think, at Politics and Prose for he's batting 1,000. This is his 7th appearance at Politics and Prose for 7 books. So that's right up there with the record, I'm pretty sure. I was racking my brain to think of who's done more of their author talks here, but we are delighted. And we'll be having you back for book 8, book 9, and so on. His new book, George W. Bush, is part of a series, as some of you may know, of presidential biographies written by noted authors and edited by Arthur Schlesinger and Sean Wilentz, 2 eminent historians. And the idea was to provide smart and thorough portrayals of each of our presidents, but to do so in a way that was concise and accessible so that you don't have to spend, you don't have to have the doorstop version of the book. You can actually read in an afternoon and get a pretty good feel for these people. I'm not sure. I think they've done almost everybody but Obama and Clinton. Is that right? And Reagan. Obama, Clinton, and Reagan yet to come. Somehow W got in there before them, but we won't go into why because I don't even know. But I think it was very wise for these editors to ask Jim to take on the task of writing about our nation's 43rd president. He was well acquainted already with the subject, or at least one aspect of President Bush 43's presidency. He had written a terrific book already about the Bush foreign policy team. It's called Rise of the Vulcans. I'm sure many of you have read it. And I think one other thing that's important about this particular president and the person who writes about him is that Jim was known for his judicious temperament, sense of fairness, and thoroughness as a reporter. I suspect you also learned a little bit about diplomacy, covering all those foreign policy things, and I would think that might come in handy in this case, simply because this is a president who I think we all know, living in contemporaneous times with his tenure, that he is beloved by some, and I would say, and this may even be an understatement, loathed and derided by others. So one reviewer applauded Jim for his, quote, studied neutrality. He said both Bush supporters and detractors will like the book for its fairness. I just have to say, Jim, and you'll appreciate this. So my husband, Brad, who some of you know, who's also a co-owner of the store, wrote a huge biography of Donald Rumsfeld a few years ago. And he thought the same thing. Everybody said, oh, you're such a fair reporter. You really are calling the shots straight. You're not pulling any punches. Everyone's going to just think this is a really good, fair book. And he said, well, actually what happened was everybody was really mad at me. Because, they wanted it to be, one on one side or the other. And if it wasn't their side, then they were mad. So hopefully you won't have that problem. I think what is important is that he doesn't opine directly or emotionally about hanging chads, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, or economic recession. And I think this is a sign of those diplomatic skills I was referring to. He says at the end of the book's introduction, and this is very artful indeed, that the Bush presidency was inarguably, quote, one of the most consequential in American history. So I think I will leave it at that and let you do the rest of the explaining. But please join me in welcoming Jim Mann to Politics and Prose.
Thanks, Lissa. It's a pleasure to be back here again at what I consider my home bookstore. When Sean Willens called and asked me to do the Bush volume for this series, I thought, well, it's nice to have a nice, non-controversial president that no one remembers or cares much about. And I developed a certain envy for the columnist Gail Collins, who drew the William Henry Harrison volume for the series. The question that hangs over this book is Bush is now passing into history. He's still there. He was even at the White House yesterday. Even so, it didn't attract all that much attention. What is his legacy going to be? How will history judge him? And Bush is really one of many modern presidents who lives with what I call the Truman consolation, the Truman consolation being a president who left office unpopular, and modern presidents think anytime they're low in the polls or they're taking it in the press, eventually I will be like Truman and history will vindicate me. And many presidents live with that consolation, and Bush makes the argument it's too soon for history to judge me. Really, for Bush, Truman is really not the right standard of comparison. Truman was ridiculed. I think the right standard of comparison would be LBJ or Nixon, who were truly hated and who by many anyway, and really aroused the kind of passion that Bush did and does. Vietnam, after all, was 12 Iraqs. And so today we talk about Lyndon Johnson. People may read the Caro book and say that he was a monster, but people talk about the Civil Rights Act of '64. People talk about the Voting Rights Act of '65. With Nixon, the passions are the same, but people say, well, he went to China. So I can already hear you say to yourselves, George W. Bush had nothing like the Civil Rights Act of '64 or the opening to China, and you would be right. And so that's the end of the comparisons, and let's now look at more closely at George W. Bush himself. Sure. Is that better? Okay, good. And so what I say in response to Bush's claim that it's just plain too early for history to judge, that it really is not too early on some of the major aspects of his presidency. It's not too soon to draw conclusions about two of the most important things he did, certainly the war in Iraq and the tax cuts, which I think will be two of the main elements of his legacy. On Iraq, I say that the war was a strategic blunder of epic proportions, and that we can judge the war almost inside Bush's own definition or terms, which is the way he said the war, what he said about the war before it started. It wound up, it was going to cost less than $100 billion. It cost $1 trillion. It was going to last 2 years. You can, how you want to define when we got out of Iraq, we're still there. But it lasted at least 5 times or 6 times as long. And the mistaken assumptions at the beginning of the war go on and on. I can tell you, because I was reporting on it, that the policymakers really did sincerely believe that once the United States proceeded with military action, that along the way the Allies would eventually join in. And they were truly stunned when they failed to get the support that they thought that they were going to get. On the tax cuts, I think people's association now, when I talk to people or tell people I'm writing about Bush and Iraq comes up, and the tax cuts come up less often. I think probably that's for a lasting impact on the United States, the tax cuts were arguably just as great or greater. And just to bring home what that means, I mentioned in the books, Bush had 2 rounds of tax cuts. The first were income tax cuts that applied to everybody, but certainly favored upper-income Americans. The second were on capital gains and dividends. And if you take just the Walton family, 4 kids, and you take the 10 years of the Bush tax cuts just on dividends, putting aside personal income taxes, putting aside capital gains, that they saved $3.9 billion worth of taxes. So the tax cuts, well, I say that when you drive around and you see huge mega mansions, or you see yachts, or you see unrepaired bridges, or you see other parts of infrastructure that need repair, you need to think about those tax cuts and what they meant. And it is true that Obama allowed the tax cuts on upper income people to run out in 2011, but the legacy was there. The money was gone. It almost bankrupted the federal government. And one other thing on the taxes, the second round of tax cuts made history. It was passed over perhaps in the middle of the excitement of the war, but the tax cuts of 2003, every single American president since the Civil War has raised taxes to help pay for or defray the costs of a war. Bush cut them. Again, something historic, unprecedented, and really not for the good of the country. So let me turn for a second. How did this all come about? Let me turn to Bush's personality, upbringing, and his political career. And those are not separate. It's impossible, in my mind, to separate out the two, because let me begin on Bush's personality and politics with an anecdote. Bush had a tendency to surprise. There was always a little bit more there than you thought. During the 2000 campaign, many of you read, and I would assume many still believe, the following: that Bush had traveled outside the United States almost not at all before he took office. If you believe that, it's because you read it in the newspapers. And the newspapers were specific. He'd only made 4 trips, one to China, one to visit Jenna and to visit Israel, one to West Africa, representing his father. This was repeated over and over again. So in writing my previous book about the administration, I remember looking at a transcript. 3 years in, George Bush was making his first trip to London. It was the fall of 2003, and I'm looking at the transcript of an interview with David Frost. And Bush says, London, love to go to London. Laura and I went to London a lot. I saw cats there. I used to do a lot of pub crawling there. And I said, what? Wait a minute. And I checked, and I took a look again. And in fact, Bush, in his young adult days, was a member of an organization called Young Presidents. And yes, he had traveled to Europe. He traveled across the continent. He'd made a bunch of trips. So think about that for a second. This was not some minor thing that he hadn't traveled abroad. It appeared in editorials in our nation's leading newspapers. Did they correct the record? No, they did not correct the record. Why did they not correct the record? Because in some ways, it's to Bush's political advantage. There are more people out there who identify with a guy who didn't travel overseas than a guy who did, up and down the East Coast. It's considered a detriment. But in general, it's not such a bad thing if people think he hasn't traveled that much. And that's kind of an introduction to the nature of the Bush personality. He was always good at playing country boy for his political advantage. So his grandfather had grown up in Ohio and spent his life on the East Coast. His father was from Connecticut. His father moved to Texas, and Bush was born there, and there was both a lot of Midland, Texas in him, and he used Midland for political purposes throughout his political career. One of his favorite quotes, I went to Sam Houston Elementary School in Midland, Texas, and my dad went to Greenwich Country Day School in Connecticut. That's one of the differences between us. When he was governor, the first day on the job, he tells some legislator, just remember, I'm from Midland, I'm not from Dallas. So it's anti-big city. It's not just East Coast, West Coast. I'm from rural Texas. Of course, the line that he went to Sam Houston Elementary School misses something, which is that he also went to Andover and Yale. That's not part of the litany. I'll come back to that in a second. He did go to Yale, and once again, it ignites his sort of anti-liberal, anti-East Coast passions. And so the story that brought it home, when he's a freshman at Yale, his father is running for office for the first time in Texas. And I know all of you have, understandably, a view of George H.W. Bush, the moderate. So you may be surprised to know that when he first ran for office in Texas, his positions were opposition to the Civil Rights Act of '64. I should have said this is '64. Opposition to the Test Ban Treaty that Kennedy had negotiated. And if China gets into the United Nations, we should pull out of the United Nations. He handed his son, George W., a copy of Conscience of a Conservative and said, read this. It's important. So George Bush goes down to campaign with his father, and his father loses. He's bitterly disappointed. He gets back to Yale. He's still a freshman. And the people my age will remember William Sloane Coffin, the anti-war chaplain there. He runs into William Sloane Coffin, who knew his father well, and he said, I'm really sorry your father lost, but he lost to a better man. And Bush was, the younger Bush, was furious. And that was really this is his freshman year, the beginning of his long hatred of Yale, which lasts for many years until finally, while he's in the White House, he has a reception for their 40th anniversary or reunion. He goes back to Texas and is struggling in business. He tries to run for Congress, and it's the only race he ever loses, not including 2000 against Al Gore. And when he runs, he's now in his late 20s. He runs against a guy named Kent Hance, who portrays him as East Coast snob. We don't need somebody from the Northeast telling us what the problems are, Hance says of Bush. Bush puts on a television spot that shows him out jogging. Big mistake. Hance tells people the only time folks around here go running is when somebody's chasing them. So Bush learns from this mistake, never let that happen again, and he never lets any distance arise between him and that image of Midland. In the 1980s, he goes through a couple of transformations, personal and political. So the key event around which to tell this would be the spring of 1985. His father, then vice president, calls the family together at Camp David, big Bush gathering. And he says, I want you all to know I've decided I am going to run for president in 1988. You're all going to be under scrutiny. Hint, hint. George W., who has had serious problems with alcohol, gives up alcohol cold within a year. And by Laura Bush's own acknowledgement, one of the reasons was his father's campaign, what his father said that day. Second transformation is that he begins to turn towards evangelical religion. You need to look at the coincidence of this and the timing of politics. His father had decided to run, and his father needed support from evangelicals. Again, even people with long memories may not remember, but before Reagan, the evangelicals supported Jimmy Carter and had been part of the coalition in the South. George H.W. Bush is worried about that. And take it any way you will. I don't know what to make of it, but right then, George W. Bush turns towards evangelical Christianity and at the same time becomes the Bush senior campaign's liaison with evangelicals. he is the guy to try and keep evangelicals in the campaign. There's one other thing that happens at that 85 meeting. George W. and Jeb confront the guy who was going to run their father's campaign, Lee Atwater. Many of you know Lee Atwater as a very skilled political pro. He's preparing to run the campaign. George W. and Jebs think, well, he's a pro. How do we know? Parts of his campaign firm are supporting. There are other people working for Jack Kemp. So they go to Lee Atwater and they say, how do we know we can trust you? And Atwater kind of pulls up, and Jeb says, what he means is, are you willing to throw yourself under a bus for my dad? And Atwater says, well, if you don't trust me, why don't one of you come up to Washington? You can work right alongside me. You can work at the next desk. You can look over my shoulder. And George W., who at that time, his businesses are going nowhere. He's kind of been bought out in his oil business, takes him up on it. And so he goes and he works alongside Atwater on his father's campaign. He learned a lot of politics at Atwater's feet, and that's very hard-boiled politics. They get along really well. Actually, Atwater and Karl Rove are really his two political advisors. Atwater, however, dies in 91. And from there, I mean, it's a mistake to think that his parents discouraged W from running. W was, he had the inside track. He was ahead. He was older. When his father was in the White House, this brought it home to me, just how close he was and how much in the inner circle he was. Mikhail Gorbachev comes to dinner at the White House. Very small private dinner. 8 people at the table. The 2 Gorbachevs, George and Barbara Sr., Jim Baker and Susan Baker, Brent Scowcroft, and George W. Bush. So although he had the image of the clown, he was always in there, and it was not surprising to me. He started running for governor first. He won the race for governor in 1994 that his brother Jeb lost. And once George W. Bush won re-election as governor, his father's phrase was, once he won a second time, it was a 6-inch putt to the Republican nomination. He really basically waltzed into the Republican nomination. At just this stage of the presidential race in 1999, Bush lined up all the money that was out there, and all of his rivals dropped out for lack of money. Dan Quayle, Jack Kemp, Liddy Dole, and the fourth was Steve Forbes, who didn't drop out for lack of money. But in fact, the presence of Forbes, a tax cutter, prompted Bush to enter the race with a huge tax cut proposal. So he promised to do what, in fact, he did. And that kind of preempted Forbes. He didn't run either. So his promise in the campaign, his entire foreign policy, was that he, in his words, I've got the greatest group of foreign policy advisors that anybody could ever have. And by that, he was referring to his father's team from the George H.W. Bush presidency. And that turned out to be wrong. It turned out to be wrong in 2 respects. First, he didn't recognize, and it's an interesting question, but I'm not even sure George H.W. Bush recognized how bad the blood was within that team, how badly they were divided. They were divided, in one sense, historically, going back 20 or 30 years to the well into the Cold War, the fights between neoconservatives and realists within the Republican Party, dating back to the days of Henry Kissinger. They were also divided at the time of the Gulf War. I mean, Dick Cheney and Colin Powell rode in victory celebrations together, but they didn't see eye to eye. Powell at one point acknowledged, he joked in his biography that he considered Cheney and his associates a bunch of crazies, some joke. And really, Cheney and the civilians around around Cheney resented Colin Powell. He was the most powerful chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that there had ever been. There were legal changes that increased his power. They really couldn't match Powell's power within the Pentagon. So they take office, and there's one other mistake they make about the advisors. The second one, which is the advisors were entirely focused on the role of state actors, countries. That was, in their experience in the Cold War, in the Persian Gulf War, that's what counted. They were not focused on non-state actors. At the time that Bush was coming to the White House, Clinton tried to warn him, Sandy Berger tried to warn Condoleezza Rice that this thing called Al-Qaeda was really important, and watch this, it was as important as anything he was going to face in foreign policy. And they may have tried to get it. George Tenet, who was the CIA director for both of them, said, if you haven't gotten that call in the middle of the night saying an American ship has been or embassies have been bombed, you don't get it. You just don't feel it. And they didn't. And that proved to be important. They didn't do much with those warnings, and that, of course, brought us and them to September 11th. The impact of September 11th, I think, was best described by the guy who joined the administration late. That was Bob Gates, who said, I think he's trying to describe what got into this Bush team. I think there was a huge sense among senior members of the administration of having let the country down, of having allowed a devastating attack on America to take place on their watch. And preventing another attack became the sole preoccupation of the team. I thought that said very well, really, how they reacted to September 11th. Of course, in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, for a couple of weeks, George Bush was looked upon as a great president, reacting well. The people ranging from the New York Times, Johnny Apple, Joe Biden, all full of praise for George W. Bush. Problem was that then he had some policy decisions to make, and it didn't take long before they were moving towards, it took really less than 4 months for them to be moving towards the war in Iraq, where they made all of those mistakes. And they also made one other thing. They made some conceptual mistakes. They identified with the Truman administration. People like Rice, in particular, and Bush, I think listening to Rice on this, really thought this was a new era and that all of the old doctrines of foreign policy should be thrown out. And that meant deterrence from the Cold War. That meant containment. And throwing out all those doctrines provides a rationale for moving against Saddam Hussein. I'm going to skip now to near the end of the administration. Actually, in Bush's second term, depending on how you want to count it, either in 2005 or certainly after congressional elections of 2007, really Bush launches out into conducting a team in an administration in which Dick Cheney, his vice president, is marginalized. And in those final 2 years of his presidency, something that's recognized by not too many people, but is recognized by the Obama team. He was launching out in new directions. So it's, in fact, in those last 2 years, with Cheney marginalized, the Bush administration becomes more dovish on North Korea for a time than the Obama administration has been in any of its first 6 years. Bush starts the way towards diplomacy with Iran. And with great reluctance, he signs the Status of Forces Agreement with Iraq that paves the way for an American withdrawal of troops by 2011. The Obama people picked that up. So if you look in their campaign in 2008, there are several points where they attack John McCain by saying, "Look, he wants to do things that Bush doesn't want to do. He's more hawkish than Bush," which was true. And after they take office, one of the Obama team's response to the criticism, which you all hear and may say, that actually there weren't enough changes between between Bush and Obama, or that the Obama administration represented a continuation. The Obama response was, "That's right, we're a continuation of Bush's last 2 years." Still not enough change, but that represented how they thought of it. So I'm going to just close with the Bush. With the Bush post-presidency, and then take your questions. Bush became the most inactive ex-president I think we've seen for a while. He seems to have intended it that way. There was a point a year or so before he left office when he was giving his annual speech to the UN General Assembly, and he looks out at the UN building, and there's Bill Clinton across the way in the lobby, and he says, you won't find me, when I leave the White House, you won't find me hanging around the United Nations." And that was certainly true. It's odd that Cheney has become much more than Bush the defender of many of the Bush policies. Bush really seems to have stuck to two public positions on political issues. One is immigration. He's strongly pro-immigration, and he's said so continually since he left office. And internationalism. I mean, he's opposed to isolationism. You would not be surprised to hear that, but he says that. He almost never comments on whether it's interrogation or Iraq. He doesn't, and he's so inactive that it leaves you with the question of what core beliefs did he really have beyond that are separate from his political career and his political fortunes. And now I will just give you the last paragraph of the book, because it's my overall conclusion. Bush was not responsible for all of America's difficulties, yet the far-reaching actions he took, particularly on Iraq and the tax cuts, further compounded the nation's problems. Once, in the middle of a discussion with his military advisors, Bush made a telling observation. "Somebody's got to be risk-averse in this process, and it better be you," he's telling his military advisors, "because I'm not." George W. Bush was for sure not risk-averse. He took gambles both in foreign policy and with the economy. Sometimes they paid off, yet overall the country paid heavily for the risks he took. Thanks. Happy to take your questions.
Thanks for a very substantive and very generous presentation. You didn't, keep us having to buy the book because you didn't tell us the story, but many of us, I hope, will. My question is, in the time from when you started working on the book to when you finished it, in what aspects did you significantly change your perspective, your opinion of the man in the presidency?
In policy, probably not that much at all. For Bush personally, I ended up surprised at his political skill. I kind of thought he went in just as a son of, and I realized as I was going through his career that he was really a much better politician than his father. That just didn't have the substance with it.
Hi.
Hi.
So first of all, kudos for talking about the tax cuts. People do not talk about the damage that they did enough. My question is, you and I and George W. are all of an age.
You're outing me here.
The biggest thing in when we came of age was the Vietnam War, and the draft. And he was at Yale. It's a male campus. It was a male campus then, and that was all anybody thought about. They were all draft bait, and the war was going badly. He knew he wouldn't have to go, I'm sure. Do you think did it make any impression on him at all? Was he just oblivious to it, or did he learn something from it? Take a lesson from
the war itself.
From the war and the response to the war. I mean, we all thought it was we didn't all think it was a terrible war, but many of us thought it was a terrible war. And we were losing. It was the first one we had lost.
As for substantive position, I'm not surprised that he didn't come out against the war. First of all, he didn't oppose the war. I'm not surprised he didn't. His father didn't, in the first place. But beyond that, at Yale, he really wanted no part of protests. He hated people who were involved in politics or journalism. He loved to tell people how much he disliked Strobe Talbot. I think he made jokes about Strobe Talbot because Strobe Talbot was editing the Yale Daily. He recognized the war as something he was going to have to deal with by finding a place in the Texas National Guard. And he did that. I'm not going to try and rehearse here all of the arguments about favoritism. The best you can say is that he got the same favored position as other Texas politicians like Lloyd Benson, but it was favoritism. And so there was never a question that he was going to go fight in the war.
Right, but when he started the war in Iraq?
Yeah.
When he thought about war, do you think Vietnam played any part in all? No. That he thought of one in terms of the other, or just Vietnam just passed him by and he didn't have to fight in it and he forgot it?
I think that's true for him, and for his team. The Vietnam syndrome was what they thought they overcame with the Persian Gulf War.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wonder if you fill out your thoughts that you expressed in your final paragraph, where you said he was certainly not risk averse. He took chances. Some of them paid off, but some of them didn't. You've certainly given us the prime examples of where they didn't pay off. Can you talk a little bit about where they did? I'm not aware of what they are, but more generally, can you just say something about his successes to whatever extent you think he had successes?
I'll take those separately. The risk that paid off was the surge in Iraq, and we can get into larger arguments about how long it lasted or whatever. But really, he had the leaders of the armed forces and everybody up to and including what was known as the Baker-Hamilton Commission, which was, after all, chaired by his father's leading advisor. Lots of advice not to do that, and he took the gamble that his own advisors, led by Steve Hadley, his national security advisor, were right, and that one did pay off. It was a huge gamble. On what other positive things he did, as everyone, including Bill Clinton, recognizes, his AIDS program in Africa, commonly known as PEPFAR, seems to be generally recognized as a good thing.
Mr. Mann, thank you. I would also add that on Africa, I think he did more than any other president in U.S. history. And other presidents, as you said, President Clinton has recognized that, and he's continued to do that. So that's sort of an answer to the question of what is he doing now. He's focusing on Africa. I
think Bono has also recognized that. Yeah.
Right. I would like to ask about the tax cuts. Does your book get into the reasons for the tax cuts? Of course, the president inherited a recession. There was the dot-com bust, and there was 9/11, and perhaps people on the upper income benefited, but also, as I understand it, many people were actually taken off the rolls, so they don't have to pay any federal income tax as a result of those tax cuts that were supported in a bipartisan fashion. So I think there is that side to it. I don't know how much you get into those aspects in your book, but there are some reasons for why the tax cuts occurred. I was hoping you could address that.
Well, first, in point of fact, you mentioned September 11th, but the first and biggest tax cuts were before September 11th. They were really in the first 4 months, and as I said, he had campaigned saying he would do that. Having said that, his rationale for the tax cuts changes from when it starts. We have this surplus and we can afford to give this money back. People almost forget what kind of a surplus there was because by the time he left office, no one could remember. But
again, he inherited a recession, and there was a dot-com bust. So those were other factors in increasing the deficit.
Actually,
I think that's a fact.
It's the rationale changed from there's a surplus to recession because he didn't inherit a recession.
The recession started soon after he took office.
Okay.
And so,
but also, the tax cuts came.
And also, there was a little bit of a bubble in the previous administration. Whether President Clinton was responsible for that or not, I'm not necessarily blaming him for that, but there were some economic realities.
Well, look, there's a larger debate about tax cuts, but it's enough to say that he was given other options, including by his own Treasury Secretary said, look, if you want to return, there are three options, of course. You can use this money of the surplus to pay down the debt. We can launch new federal programs, or we can give money back to taxpayers. If we're going to give money back to taxpayers, Paul O'Neill said, why don't we have one big rebate, one shot, rather than a tax cut which is going to last as the deficits mount, and he rejected that.
I just don't know of a time in history when someone's raised taxes in a tough economic environment. So I think that was probably one of the choices that was faced at the time.
Okay, let's.
So anyway, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, my question goes to the relationship between Mr. Cheney and Mr. Bush. You noted that in the last 2 years, Mr. Bush was far more assertive, and I think Mr. Cheney has said a couple of things when asked in interviews who's the decision maker, and obviously the famous quote, "I'm the decision maker."
Decider, yeah.
The decider, right. So this, more pointedly, I'd like to ask about the torture situations. Since, I think it was last year, Mr. Cheney said, Mr. Bush knew about every single thing, that interrogation method, and he approved them personally. We haven't heard, of course, I haven't heard anything from Mr. Bush on that, but I think there's a very strong case that this was torture. And do you have I always have thought it came from Cheney and Addington, and of course with the Department of Justice elements in it. But can you address those points, the relationship between Cheney and Bush, particularly with regard to the torture practices?
So two things. First, on torture, of course it was torture by any dictionary definition. The reason that they kept from calling it torture, there was a legal reason, because torture is mentioned in a long list of international treaties that we would be violating. So yes, and on the torture, I was surprised. I didn't quite catch up with the reaction to the recent Senate report, the Feinstein report. Some people said they heard that it in some way absolved Bush. That's not true. I mean, I say in the book that Bush approved the methods. He eliminated one or two of them. I mean, you can't believe what the original proposals were. There was a proposal to bury people alive, and I forget whether that one was the one rejected by Bush, but he did rule a couple out. You're right that the vice president's office was much more closely involved with this, but they did go to Bush. There's no doubt about that. On the larger question of the role, it's not that Cheney it's not that he had control over Bush's psyche or something. He was there. Bush named him vice president because he wanted him to run the government, because he felt insecure. And this is with his father's advice. Karl Rove, for example, did not want Cheney on the ticket. I mean, Karl Rove is a political advisor. What does Cheney bring? The state of Wyoming. Great. And furthermore, Cheney had a conservative record that Rove realized it would be a target in the campaign. Bush wanted him there for his experience, so it's not surprising that he relied on him. And then what made matters worse is that at the time in 2000 he was thinking that he hadn't quite thought through the implications of appointing Cheney's own mentor, Donald Rumsfeld, as Secretary of Defense. So that's more than he bargained for. And the amazing fact is, I think Bush himself was kind of, I don't know what, sort of passive about this at the beginning, and then it took him a long time to react. I mean, there's some signs of him reacting to try and reassert his own authority over his team by 2004, but it really takes till 2006. Rumsfeld offers to quit in 2004. It's immediately after Abu Ghraib. I take that as a not a Henry Kissinger, I'm resigning now, tell me to come back. I mean, I think Rumsfeld really, it was after Abu Ghraib. And Bush decided to keep him on, first because he claimed he didn't have a replacement, and when 3 years later it turned out he did. But also because it was an election year, and it would look like that the Pentagon was in trouble in the middle of a war, and that he would be responsible for it. So that's away from Cheney. Rumsfeld is a step away from Cheney, but a very close step. Oh, I'm sorry.
Thanks. To what extent did George Bush, being an evangelical supporter or courting the evangelicals, cancel out the status of the so-called Arabists in his father's administration, James Baker, Caspar Weinberger, and George Shultz, because they had taken moves that a lot of people that liked Israel didn't approve of, opening up to the PLO and so forth. So it seems like they came full circle about 12 years later in his policies. Do you think the evangelical connection was very persuasive in his foreign policy beliefs? Or do you think that's overstated?
No, I don't. Actually, I think you're putting together things that are connected but don't quite get there, because I think the evangelicals were an important part of his political support, and it's true that the evangelicals are strongly supportive of Israel. But for Bush, I think Israel was a foreign policy issue. I don't think the evangelicals were the main support. I don't think he paid much attention on that in that respect. I think what counted for Bush on Israel was his foreign policy team and what they thought, and they were strongly supportive.
One more question. Rumsfeld was not considered to be a typical neocon, but he ended up being really, really hawkish, or at least perceived that way. Can you talk about that? Or
First, Rumsfeld didn't come out. There was a neoconservative movement. It was actually started with domestic policies. People like Irving Kristol, who were unhappy with the changes of the 60s, and so Rumsfeld wasn't part of that. But more importantly, he wasn't really a neoconservative. He was a hawk. The way to crystallize that would be to look at this. that Rumsfeld's view of Iraq was you go in, you win the war, and you get out. The neoconservative view was we're going to bring about a democratic government. The neoconservatives were vastly more interested in the issue of democracy than Rumsfeld or Cheney, I think, were.
Okay, thanks.
One last question, and I just want to say before we end that I should have said this at the beginning. We have plenty of copies of the book. It's up front, and Jim will be happy to do a signing after we're done here at the table. And ma'am, you are the final word here.
Okay. We often hear it said that Barbara Bush said the wrong son became president. Is that apocryphal or not?
I think that is apocryphal, yeah. She discouraged W from running for governor. W began talking about running for governor in really right after his father became president. And she discouraged that, and she said that she was afraid if her husband was president or her son was governor, that either one would bring the unpopularity of either one would attach to the other. But after that, no. I mean, it's one of those things that hangs there. You hear people say that from time to time. But it's a little bit like another common myth, which is George H.W. Bush opposed the invasion of Iraq, when all the evidence is otherwise. But everybody knows someone who thinks that.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for coming. Thank
Thanks.
you all for coming.